Have you ever lost a game because your opponent ignored the opening principles and you didn't know how to punish them? Today, I'm going to show you how Mikhail Tal brutally punished anyone who broke those principles, using simple ideas you can start applying in your own games right away. So let's take a look at a game between Mikhail Tal and Georgy Tringov. I picked this game for a very specific reason. It shows, move by move, what happens when one player follows the opening principles and the other one just ignores them. And the prize for that is brutal. And to make things easier for you, I added chapters in the video description with the key instructive moments from the analysis. So if you ever want to revisit a specific moment later, just check the description down below. This game is a great way to illustrate basic opening principles, so it's worth quickly going over what they are. First, you want to control the center, and you usually do that by pushing the pawns when the E and D files to take over those key central squares. Second, you develop your pieces early and fast, getting as many of them into the game as possible. And third, you've got to keep your kings safe, usually by castling. Now, along with those three pillars, there are a few practical guidelines that really make a difference. You generally want to develop your knights before your bishops, because knights don't have that many squares available, so it's easier to find a good spot for them right away. And it's also crucial not to move the same piece more than once in the opening, because when you do that, you're basically wasting time that could be spent bringing your other pieces into the game. You see this all the time, especially with beginners. They bring a knight out early on and then keep moving that same knight back and forth without realizing that every temple they spend moving it again is a temple they're not using to develop the rest of their pieces. And that's just as important if you want the position to actually work as a whole. And don't bring your queen out too early, because she can get attacked by less valuable pieces, and then you end up wasting precious tempi just trying to save her instead of finishing your development. In this game, you can actually see all of these principles in action very clearly. Tal sticks to the opening principles basically to the letter, while Tringov makes a series of pretty questionable decisions. And that's really the lesson here, watching how one of the greatest players in history punishes someone who doesn't respect those basic principles. Now, this is especially helpful if you're just starting out, because here's what's going to happen in practice. You're going to learn the principles, you're going to start playing the right way, but your opponents still won't be doing that. And when that happens, you've got to know how to take advantage of that gap. And that's exactly what Tal does in this game. Mikhail Tal has the white pieces, and he starts with pawn to e4, while Tringov replies with pawn to g6, which might look a little strange at first. But at higher levels, this kind of setup is known as the modern defense, or more broadly, a hyper-modern approach. And the whole idea is to deliberately give up the center, either partially or completely, so you can counterattack the center white build later on. It's totally playable, and you're going to see this kind of thing pretty often, right? The point of pawn to g6 is to prepare bishop to g7. Once white grabs the center with d4, that bishop is going to point straight at those central squares, and black will try to hit back at the center with his pieces. That's basically the plan in modern openings. You allow the center for now, and then you go after it with pieces later. I mean, it's a reasonable idea, and it works well. There are some very strong openings in the style, like the King's Indian defense, for example. So let's see how that idea worked out in this game. Tal plays knight to c3, a completely natural developing move, and Tringov answers with d6, probably trying to stop some kind of pawn push from white. Tal keeps developing with knight to f3, and just look at what he's done so far. He followed the principle of knights before bishops, took over the center with his pawns controlling all those key squares, and placed his knights on their most natural squares, you know? It's literally exactly what we talked about earlier. And here, Tringov goes pawn to c6, which is already starting to look a bit questionable because, well, while Tal has all his pieces out and well placed, white's lead in development is becoming more and more obvious, right? Tal keeps developing and now goes bishop to g5, which is a pretty provocative move because now black has to think about h6 to try to kick that bishop out. And maybe that's exactly Tal's idea, to tempt black into pushing even more pawns and making more and more concessions. But Tringov chooses a different path here. He goes queen to b6, trying to punish that developing move by going after the pawn on b2, which is now hanging. And this is the first big lesson of the game, and it's a really important one. When you've got a development advantage as big as Tal has here, the entire center, 2 knights developed, a bishop already out, while black only has a small presence in the center and 1 active bishop, you've got to start looking for more creative options. With that kind of lead in development, you can even sack a bit of material, maybe a pawn or sometimes even a piece, just to open up the position and unleash your pieces, because they've got way more play than your opponents, you know? So with that in mind, Tal plays a move that doesn't even try to defend the pawn on b2. He just ignores the attack and goals queen to d2. The point is to defend the knight on c3 so that if Tringov actually grabs on b2, the knight's protected and Tal can go rook to b1, hating the queen and picking up even more development time. And that's exactly what happened. After the queen goes to a3, which is basically the only square, Tal, in return for the pawn he sacked, ends up with his queen on a more active square and a rook on a semi-open file, which is huge. Now, the gap in development is starting to get ridiculous. Tal continues with the bishop to c4, bringing his last minor piece into the game. And here, Tringov may be worried about his queen getting trapped on a3, goes queen to a5. But at this point, he's just bleeding time, and we're about to see why. He went queen to b6, then took on b2, then queen to a3, then queen to a5, and after every single one of those moves, Tal answered with a productive developing move, right? Tal castles kingside and has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points of development, not even counting his pawn center. Black has only 2, his queen out and 1 active bishop. 7-2 is literally a massive development advantage, like really massive. And now the game really starts to get interesting, as we're about to see. Once Tal finishes his development and gets all his pieces into the game, the attack just comes naturally out of the position. And that's when Black starts to run into a big problem. His pieces simply aren't in the game, and it's like incredibly hard to defend when none of them are ready to help. Tringov goes e6, maybe trying to keep the position closed, slow things down a bit, and control the squares where White's pieces could break in. It's understandable, because when you're behind a development, sometimes you just want to close it up and buy yourself some time. But Tal does exactly what the position calls for and brings his last piece into play with rook to e1. This is really instructive because before going all in on the attack, he makes sure every single piece is involved. Nothing's sitting on the back rank, everything's coordinated and ready to go. And then comes a6, which is a pretty dubious decision in this situation. It's well past time to develop pieces, and playing a move like this that doesn't bring any new piece into the game is extremely risky, especially against Mikhail Tal. Against the player who's this tactical and aggressive, leaving your king in the center without getting your pieces out is basically asking for trouble. Just look at the position now. The rook lined up against the king, all of Tal's pieces ready to jump in, while Black is still trying to get organized. It's a really scary position for Black, because once the attack starts, there just aren't going to be enough pieces to hold it together. Tal goes bishop to f4, and now the attack really starts to take shape. The move comes with tempo on the pawn, and it's also a bit provocative because it kind of tempts Black to go e5 to keep the position closed. And that's exactly where that earlier advice kicks in. When you've got this kind of lead in development, you've got to start thinking about sacks. Tringov plays e5, Tal cancels with pawn takes e5, and after pawn takes, now the fireworks begin. The first big move is queen to d6, and this is a double sack. He's offering both the bishop on f4 and the knight on c3, which is now hanging. Neither piece can be taken safely. In the game, Tringov went queen takes c3, but if instead he had played pawn takes f4 and grabbed bishop, the crushing line starts with knight to d5, threatening knight to c7. It might look like yet another piece sack, but you simply can't take it. If Black grabs there, after White recaptures, that open file is going to bring massive problems. And this is where you really see the hidden potential Tal's pieces had all along. When he put the rook on e1, the file was still closed, but the rook was just waiting. Now that the file's open, it comes crashing in with full force. So after knight to b5, you just can't take that knight. One idea would be knight to d7, so that after knight to c7, Black could at least try king to d8 since the knight would be blocking the file. But then another piece jumps in, you can go knight to g5, and now the ideas get really dangerous. After knight to f6, you can even sack with knight to e6, mixing in ideas like knight to f6, bishop to f7, knight to e6, and its mate no matter what. The best defensive try here would be knight to e5. But just to show it again, if Black grabs on d5, it's still lost to pawn takes d5 check. The king has nowhere to run and the position is just completely lost. Knight to e5, like I said, would resist a bit more, but now the knight isn't blocking the file anymore, and since the queen controls d8, White can go knight to c7. Black has to give up the queen for the knight, and the position is totally lost. So taking the bishop on f4 didn't work either. In the game, Tringov went queen takes c3, grabbing the knight, but it's still losing because now comes rook d1. The point is that the e-file probably isn't going to open anymore, like we talked about earlier, so he shifts the rook to the best square, where it's most active, and now there's the immediate threat of queen to d8, and that's just mate. Tringov plays knight to d7 to try to stop the mate, and now I want you to pause the video and see if you can find Tal's move. There's only one move that wins here, so go ahead, pause it for a second, and really think this position through. The move and the idea behind it is super instructive. And here's one more hint. From this point on, it's a forced mate in 5 if black defends as accurately as possible. Alright, so I'm hoping you paused and gave it a real shot. And I'm hoping you found bishop takes f7 check, yet another sack that's going to carry white to the win. Now black has two choices. Either take the bishop or move the king. In the game, Tringov takes the bishop, but if he moves the king instead, he still gets mated. It's just a little less obvious at first glance. Both routes are mate in 5, but let's look at the line where the king runs. From here, white goes knight to g5, threatening knight to e6, mate, and there's basically no defense. That knight is pinned, so it can't move to let the bishop cover d6, and no other piece can step in to defend that square, except the queen. So queen to c4 is forced. And if you want to finish this as clean as possible, you don't even have to take the queen. The killer move is rook to d5. The idea is simple. You just sack the rook to cut the queen off, and you're right back to threatening mate. You know, if the queen takes on d5, it's defending e6 again, sure, but then you take the queen, and after that, you finish with mate on e6. And if black tries to stall with queen to f1 check, which is the move that delays mate the most, it still doesn't change anything. There's literally no move that actually stops knight to e6, and no matter what black does from here, knight to e6 is checkmate. But like I said, in the game, after bishop takes f7, Tringov grabbed it, and it's still mate in 5. After knight to g5, the idea is basically the same. King to e8 is forced, and Tal goes queen to e6. At that point, after queen to e6, Tringov resigned, because the attack is just overwhelming. There's simply no defense. The only real tries here are knight to e7, and that loses because white has queen to f7 check. After king to d8, it's knight to e6 mate, very similar to what we saw earlier. And if instead of blocking with knight to e7, he plays king to e8 right away, then comes knight to f7 check, king to c7 is forced, and queen to d6 is mate. So, after seeing all that, Tringov resigned. That was the game, a super instructive measure. You just watched Tal completely crush his opponent for ignoring basic opening principles. But now flip the script. What happens when it's your opponent playing a move that looks strong against you? I'm talking about that annoying bishop pin that shows up in all kinds of openings, and you never quite know what to do. Do you kick it, ignore it, trade it off? And while you're sitting there thinking, the damage is already done. Well, Capablanca figured out how to make your opponent seriously regret ever playing that pin. So, click the video on your screen right now. In it, I'll show you 5 devastating ways to punish the bishop pin. It works for white and for black, including the Legal's mate trap that your opponent never sees coming. Go quicker now, because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. If you enjoyed and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.